All right, today we're going to be going over chapter 16, lymphatic system and immunity, because they are, believe it or not, linked. So let's get moving. So the lymphatic system is filled with a fluid called lymph. And lymph is actually, it's an interesting thing. It's the fluid that builds up between your cells inside of the tissues. So the way I think about it is water. Oops, let me get my pen going. So we're going to have water that we drink, all right, turns into plasma as it's absorbed through the digestive tract, which we'll go over in the digestive system chapter. Plasma leaks out and becomes interstitial fluid. IF, interstitial fluid. And that interstitial fluid is the fluid surrounding cells in all of your tissues of the body. Interstitial fluid drains into the lymphatic system and becomes lymph, where it is filtered and dumped back into your bloodstream and becomes plasma again. So it's really interesting how water gets exchanged in our bodies and in our system. It gets filtered, it gets cleaned, it does get removed. Blood plasma can also go through the renal system and become urine, but we'll talk about that in the urinary system chapter. But yeah, this is where plasma is delivering fluid to your interstitial cells, to your tissues, right? So that IF is interstitial fluid in your tissues, and that has to go somewhere, or else you're going to have swelling, lymphedema, and that's where it turns into lymph in your lymphatic system. Okay, so let's talk about the lymphatic system briefly. The lymphatic vessels are kind of like blood vessels, except for they're one way. They don't circulate. They don't go in a circuit. Lymphatic vessels pick up fluid and move it towards lymphatic nodes, which we'll talk about in a minute. So there's one-way flow of lymphatic fluid, lymph itself. The lymphatic capillaries are the blind-ended tubes that pick up lymph or interstitial fluid from our tissues. They're super microscopic, they're dinky, they're tiny, and basically they look almost exactly like capillaries. They're simple squamous epithelium, except for instead of as capillaries where you're going to have stacks and stacks like this, moving blood around in one direction. The lymphatic vessels, and I know that there's a picture coming, they have a tip to them. All right, and all of these little gaps allow fluid to enter the I used to call it a lacteal. Lacteals are in the intestinal wall. Lacteals are a specific type of lymphatic capillary, but a lymphatic capillary absorbs by fluid draining between the individual cells. And then the fluid goes up into the lymphatic system. So these walls of the lymphatic system are very porous. So let's look at the principal organs in the lymphatic system, all right? There are the lymphoid organs, we'll talk about those in a minute. And then there are the organs associated with the lacteals and the lymphatic capillaries. So everything in green, all these little green ribbons here, are the lymphatic capillaries or lymphatic vessels. The capillaries are at the very ends of the vessels. The lymphatic vessels drain into lymph nodes. There are lymph nodes scattered throughout our body. The ones behind our knees are the popliteal lymph nodes. We have inguinal lymph nodes in the groin area and in the lower belly area. There are other lymph nodes associated with our arms, the axillary lymph nodes, the brachial lymph nodes. There are the lymph nodes that we're all very familiar with, associated with our neck, the cervical lymph nodes. Those are the lymph nodes that doctors palpitate when we go in and they're looking to see if we have an infection. They'll swell if we have an infection. We also have lymph nodes in our, in our thoracic area. There's the thoracic duct that terminates in the Yersinia of Chile. This is a really large lymphatic vessel. We'll talk about why that's there in a few minutes. But all of these vessels work together to bring fluid back to the heart. You'll notice that the heart's not in this picture because it's not actually part of the lymphatic system. The lymph vessels bring fluid back to the vena cava, and which drain into the right atrium. So that's how our blood plasma levels and our fluid levels remain normal. fluid leaks out into our tissues, and then the fluid gets picked up by the lymphatic vessels. Now, the other organs that we'll talk about a little bit later on are the thymus, which makes lots of white blood cells, the spleen, which has lymphatic function as well. It's like a big filter. Red bone marrow, of course, where we know white blood cells are made. There's also the tonsils and the adenoids, which are not in this picture. We'll get to that in a little bit. So now let's look at the drainage. The right lymphatic duct is on the patient's right side, and it drains lymph from half of the head and the right side of the body down to about the hip, okay? That's all. That doesn't seem like a whole lot compared to the thoracic duct itself. The thoracic duct is going to connect all the way down to the cisternae of Chile, and this is the largest lymphatic vessel in the body. That cisternae of Chile holds additional fluid that's being collected from all the other lymphatic vessels in the bottom half of the body and on the left side of the body. It drains the lymph of 3/4 of the body. So the thoracic duct handles most drainage and processing of fluid. The right lymphatic duct basically drains into actually the right subclavian vein, and the thoracic duct drains into the left subclavian vein. Those are going to join with the vena cava later on down the line. So what happens when these lymph vessels get blocked? Well, that's called lymphedema or swelling. Now, this can happen for a number of reasons. If you've ever sprained your ankle and you had a swollen ankle, swollen tissue, swollen joint, that's because sometimes the lymphatic vessels get damaged if you sprain the tissue, or additional tissue leaks out of the blood system trying to help repair the damage. Lymphedema or swelling can also be caused by a blockage of lymph vessels, and that happens when there's inflammation of the lymph vessels due to septicemia or a blood infection. We call this lymphangitis. Isn't that funny? It's like, bronchitis. Anytime you have itis, that's inflammation. Okay, so bronchitis, laryngitis, in this case, lymphangitis, that's the inflammation of the blood vessels. Elephantitis is a severe lymphedema infection that you're seeing here in this picture that actually has to do with a parasitic infection of lymph vessels. So a parasite gets into the tissue and blocks drainage, almost completely blocks it. And this is from the filaria worms that eventually, will produce these elephant-type limbs. They call them elephant-like limbs because the tissue is very swollen. It's very painful. The skin becomes cracked, very dried, and of course the tissues have a lot of pressure on them. So let's talk about lymph nodes. So the lymph vessels drain into lymph nodes, and lymph nodes act like filters. They filter lymph. Now, we'll look at the structure of a lymph node in a minute. Basically what happens is that these lymph nodes accept lymph, and inside of the lymph node, you'll have white blood cells circulating around. What this does is it allows an interaction area for lymph fluid to interact with white blood cells. So the white blood cells can basically screen and filter for any pathogens that get into lymph. Because remember, lymph vessels, the blind-ended capillaries, are very, very porous, and bacteria and viruses can get in there. So this is an opportunity for white blood cells to interact with them and destroy them before they can get into general circulation again. So the flow of lymph goes from the lymph capillary up the lymph vessel and then to the lymph node through what we call afferent, through those afferent lymph vessels, and then drains out of the lymph node through a single lymph vessel. So you have lots of lymph vessels coming in and only one going out. So let's look at how lymph gets into a lymph vessel before the lymph node. So here is an arteriole from the heart. Here's a blood capillary, fluid leaking out of the blood capillary. The fluid is in yellow. Here is a vein, or venule in this case, a smaller one. Here are tissues, just cells. And so fluid from the capillary bed and from the cells, cellular fluid, enters through these leaky lymphatic capillaries, and then it flows up to, it becomes lymph, and it flows up to the lymphatic vessels. And it says eventually to veins. That's past the lymph node. Here's what a lymph node looks like. A lymph node looks kind of like a little blueberry, maybe. Well, it looks green here. I don't know. Green berry? I don't know. So here are the lymph vessels carrying in lymph, and you can see that they have these little one-way valves on them that keep lymph from going backwards, right? Lymph only comes in. The lymph drains into the sinuses here, all right? These are cortical nodules. These nodules are going to, don't worry about what they're doing. These are the fibrous septa that separate the individual nodules, and the fluid comes into the pink areas, okay? Circulates around, interacts with white blood cells, and then drains through one efferent lymph vessel. So these are afferent lymph vessels. Afferent means coming in. Okay, afferent is always in. Efferent is out. So lymph in is afferent, lymph out is efferent when you're dealing with the lymph node. And the ileus here, we'll see ileus used again in other organs. The ileus is a large drain area where the clean lymph exits and goes to a vein farther down the line. So lymphoma is a type of cancer that is a malignant tumor of lymph nodes. So there are two types. There's Hodgkin's disease and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And basically the idea is with lymphoma, you have tumor growth inside of lymph nodes. And if it does not become metastatic, then they can just simply remove the lymph node and the cancer will be gone. If it becomes metastatic, if something happens inside one of these lymph nodes, then cancer can circulate through, can break off and circulate through the lymphatic system. And that, unfortunately, is one of the main ways that cancer spreads. Now, let me go back one more slide. Sometimes cancer will start inside of a tissue, enter lymphatic circulation, right? Hit a lymph node. And because cancer cells divide so much faster than other cells, they can get lodged in the lymph node and cause a tumor here in the lymph node. It can also shed some of the tumor cells, which will end up in efferent lymphatic circulation and eventually circulate around the body. It's not a pretty thing. All right, in the next little lecture here, we're only doing 15-minute snippets because I'm having trouble with my recording apparatus. We're going to talk about secondary lymphoid tissues.